Welcome back to this Paper Connections investigation. Today we continue our sprawling, multi-part epic, taking us deeper into the Haitian Revolution. In Episode 1, we heard the terrified words of Father Thomas. Now in Episode 2, we ask a seemingly impossible question. How did this fragile piece of paper survive a burning colony to reach us today?
That question requires us to look far beyond the ink. We have to confront the physical reality of the 18th century Atlantic world. When you examine the broader archival record of Saint-Domingue during the 1790s, you are looking at a landscape of near-total obliteration.
Complete erasure.
Exactly. Plantations were systematically reduced to ash. Colonial administrative buildings were looted. Port records, customs logs, centuries of obsessive colonial bookkeeping were simply abandoned to the damp and the fire as armies swept across the plains.
A vast paper civilization was largely erased.
Yes. Yet, you are sitting at the investigative table with us today, examining a document dated June 1797, a document that somehow slipped through that destruction.
I want you to visualize this artifact with us for a moment. Picture the heavy, tactile texture of the paper itself.
It is not the thin, mass-produced wood pulp we use today.
Yeah, no, not at all. This is woven rag paper. It was manufactured from discarded cotton and linen garments. Those textiles were collected, fermented, beaten into a slurry, and then pressed into individual sheets.
That highly intensive manufacturing process gave the paper a profound durability. It feels substantial in your hands.
It does. But the true key to its survival is not just in the fibers. If you look specifically at the upper left corner of the manuscript's first page, there is a single, carefully inscribed word written there.
A very deliberate mark.
It reads, Duplicata.
And that single word reveals the critical mechanism of the document's survival.
It changes everything about how we view its journey.
It absolutely does. In the summer of 1797, within a colony consumed by an active siege, sending a message across the ocean was a calculated gamble. There was no reliable postal service operating out of a war zone.
You could not just drop an envelope in a box.
Right. If an individual held information of immense financial or existential weight, as Father Thomas did when demanding 28,000 livres from an exiled planter, they did not simply place the paper on a ship and hope for the best.
They wrote the letter twice.
They wrote it twice.
The logistics of that correspondence strategy carry a very dark implication. The original letter would be handed to a courier, taken to the docks, and given to a ship captain who was hopefully reliable.
Hopefully, it sailed on the first available vessel.
Then, the copy of the Duplicata waited. It sat on the desk for days, perhaps weeks, waiting for a second vessel departing on an entirely different day.
Facing a completely different set of maritime odds.
Exactly. It was a hedge against the near certainty of capture or shipwreck.
It was a raw calculation of risk. If the first ship was boarded by privateers, intercepted by a naval frigate, or simply lost to a sudden Caribbean squall, the second copy might still navigate the gauntlet.
Which means we have to confront the reality of that one word in the corner of this page.
The ghost of the original.
Yes. If we are holding the Duplicata today, examining its faded ink centuries later, it almost certainly means the original letter did not make it.
It is gone.
The original is gone. It was seized, burned, or is currently resting at the bottom of the Atlantic.
That is the most probable historical outcome. And before this surviving letter, this Duplicata even reached the water, it had to survive the land.
We must trace the physical geography of its departure.
Father Thomas penned this document in Croix des Bouquets. This was a heavily fortified town situated on the cul-de-sac plain, a massive agricultural expanse.
To reach the deep-water harbor of Port-au-Prince, the letter had to traverse an 8-mile stretch of entirely hostile territory.
8 miles might sound like a brief journey to us today.
But in 1797, that sun-baked plain was a labyrinth of military checkpoints. A courier had to smuggle these pages through British occupation lines.
They had to evade royalist militia patrols.
And navigate the shifting, highly volatile front lines of the revolution itself.
If this letter, which contained details about elite financial demands and implicit observations on military movements, fell into the wrong hands, the consequences were absolute.
It was a death warrant for the courier and the author.
This brings the broader environment into focus. To comprehend the gravity of this letter's journey, we must pull back. We have to survey the macro-historical architecture of Saint-Domingue.
We are not discussing a simple agricultural outpost.
No. By the late 18th century, this western third of the island of Hispaniola was the undisputed epicenter of global wealth generation.
The economic output was unparalleled. A territory smaller than the modern state of Maryland was producing roughly 40% of Europe's sugar.
And 60% of its coffee?
The export value of Saint-Domingue exceeded that of the entire newly formed United States combined.
But we must be explicitly clear about the geopolitical reality of that wealth.
The distinction between production and power.
Precisely. While Saint-Domingue produced the capital, it was fundamentally an extractive colonial periphery.
It was not the center of the world.
Not at all. The true centers of global power were not in the Caribbean. The power resided in the financial hubs and port cities of Europe, places like Bordeaux, Nantes, and Amsterdam.
Those European centers captured the vast capital surpluses generated by the colonial workforce.
The Caribbean was the engine room. It produced the raw material. But the political steering wheel and the resulting mercantile profits remained firmly anchored in Europe.
That engine room was a place of mechanized, continuous horror.
It was. The wealth of Saint-Domingue was built entirely on a hyper-industrialized plantation system.
This was not traditional agriculture governed by the seasons. This was the prototype of the modern industrial factory floor.
Built on the violent subjugation of roughly 500,000 enslaved human beings.
The architecture of that extraction was devastating in its efficiency. Consider the sugar production process itself.
A process that had been technologically revolutionized a century prior by Dutch venture capital. The introduction of massive, water-powered 3-roller mills transformed the landscape.
Enslaved laborers were forced to harvest towering cane stalks by hand, using machetes under a punishing tropical sun.
And the cane then had to be immediately transported to the mills. Sucrose within the stalks begins to ferment almost the moment the cane is cut.
There could be no delay. Time was utilized as a weapon against the workforce.
The mills consisted of massive, iron-sheathed vertical rollers. They ground the stalks relentlessly to extract the raw juice.
The fatigue of a 16-hour or 18-hour shift frequently led to horrific injuries.
Workers routinely had their limbs caught in the crushing mechanism of those iron rollers.
Because the pace could never slow down.
Never. From those crushing mills, the extracted juice flowed directly into the boiling houses.
These structures were industrial nightmares.
The juice was transferred through a series of massive copper cauldrons, each progressively smaller and hotter than the last.
These cauldrons were heated by roaring fires built underneath the stone floors.
And those fires were fueled by the crushed, dried cane stalks themselves, a byproduct known as bagasse.
The atmosphere inside those boiling houses was apocalyptic. Enslaved men and women worked in blinding heat,
breathing thick, noxious steam,
while carefully skimming the boiling crystalline syrup to remove impurities. A single mistake could ruin a massive batch of sugar.
Or cause severe thermal burns. And the entire operation ran continuously, 24 hours a day, throughout the duration of the harvest season.
That continuous synchronized gang labor is the primary reason the mortality rate was so catastrophic.
The planter class in Saint-Domingue operated on a brutal mathematical equation regarding human life.
They calculated that it was more profitable to work human beings to death within a span of 7 to 10 years.
And simply purchase newly trafficked captives from the transatlantic slave trade.
Rather than maintain a self-sustaining, healthy population.
The commercial civilization of the 18th century, the grand stone architecture of Bordeaux, the banking houses of Frankfurt, the rum distilleries of New England, was entirely underwritten by this system.
By the synchronized violence occurring in places exactly like the cul-de-sac plain, where our letter originated.
That is the environment Father Thomas was attempting to communicate from.
He sealed his letter amid this immense, violent extraction and handed it to a courier to begin the 1,400-mile naval gauntlet to the American coast.
The voyage itself was the next impossible hurdle. Once the ship left the deep-water harbor of Port-au-Prince, it had to navigate the Windward Passage.
This is the narrow, strategically vital channel of open water situated between Saint-Domingue and Cuba.
The summer of 1797 was a perilous time to be navigating those specific waters. The United States and France were deteriorating into what historians refer to as the quasi-war.
An undeclared naval conflict fought entirely at sea.
It turned the waters off the American coast and the Caribbean into an active hunting ground.
I want to push back on the specific mechanics of that threat for a moment. How does a single paper envelope from a French colony avoid being dumped overboard when intercepted by a French privateer?
It is a valid question.
I know the statistics from the historical record show that privateers seized over 300 American merchant vessels in 1797 alone. With those odds, how does mail survive?
It comes down to sheer, unadulterated luck. French privateers were state-sanctioned pirates holding letters of marque. They were commissioned to seize enemy cargo.
If they boarded a merchant vessel, They did not simply secure the sugar and coffee in the hold.
No, they immediately located the captain's quarters and emptied the mail bags onto the deck.
Any naval vessel, whether a privateer or an official military frigate, would aggressively search private correspondence.
They were looking for tactical intelligence. A letter from a prominent priest detailing military evacuations, troop movements, or the financial vulnerabilities of the colonial elite was exactly the kind of document a privateer wanted.
They would seize it, read it, and likely destroy it to prevent the intelligence from reaching hostile hands.
The fact that this specific ship evaded the privateer gauntlet for a voyage that typically took 3 weeks is an immense statistical anomaly.
To truly understand the tension that was sealed inside this envelope before it braved that ocean, we need to listen directly to the ink on the page.
We need to examine a crucial piece of primary evidence from the manuscript. There is a postscript added to the end of the letter.
Written 10 days after the main text was completed.
It provides a profound window into the psychological state of the author at the moment of dispatch.
I will read this translation of the postscript. I want you to listen to the extreme caution in his phrasing, the deliberate, calculated withholding of information.
The silence is the most important part of this text.
I tell you nothing of the advantages we have had because no one speaks of them.
We must dissect that sentence meticulously.
The paranoia is palpable.
Father Thomas added that specific line on June 18th. To contextualize this precise historical moment, we have to look at the military map of the colony.
The brilliant general of the formerly enslaved forces, Toussaint Louverture, had been pressing a severe and highly effective siege on the British-held port of Saint-Marc,
which sat about 30 miles north of Port-au-Prince.
A siege that was directly threatening to break the back of the British occupation forces.
And by extension, the planter elite who had invited the British into the colony to protect their slave-based economy from the revolution.
Exactly. However, right before Father Thomas added this postscript, that siege had been temporarily lifted.
A combined British and Royalist force had momentarily repulsed Louverture's army. This created a highly precarious momentary window of passable postal roads.
Father Thomas recognized this was his narrow chance to get the courier out of the town and to the docks.
Yet his phrasing is steeped in absolute paranoia. I tell you nothing of the advantages we have had.
He is actively refusing to commit any military details to the paper.
He is terrified of interception. He knows the letter must travel through contested territory before it even reaches the water.
If revolutionary forces or even hostile opposing militias capture the courier and read a detailed written account of Royalist troop strengths,
or tactical advantages or specific vulnerabilities,
the consequences would be immediately fatal.
His deliberate silence on the page is the loudest indicator of the danger surrounding him.
It transforms the document from a simple piece of financial correspondence into a piece of forensic evidence.
As we apply that forensic lens to the author himself, the character of Father Claude Thomas becomes increasingly complex.
We must analyze who this man truly was. On the surface, he signs the letter Thomas, curé,
identifying himself as the parish priest of Croix de Bouquet.
In that official capacity, he baptized the children of the colonial elite, blessed their marriages, and buried their dead.
But the text of the letter reveals a secondary, deeply hidden economic function. Father Thomas was operating as a central banker,
a primary creditor for the elite planter class.
The financial demand he makes of Monsieur Rousseau in this letter is vast. He calmly requests the settlement of a debt totaling 28,264 livres.
To accurately quantify that number for you, we must look at the economic reality of the late 18th century.
A common laborer working in Paris at that exact time might earn an annual salary of roughly 300 to 500 livres.
So Father Thomas is demanding the equivalent of more than 50 years of uninterrupted peasant labor.
This is generational wealth.
This is the kind of capital required to purchase massive estates. And he lent it out on a handshake.
Based entirely on the intimate trust and credit networks shared among the colonial aristocracy.
Furthermore, our forensic archival research has unearthed a highly revealing detail about his past.
Records discovered much later in the colonial archives of Santiago de Cuba, where he eventually fled after the Revolution, identify him previously as a Dominican friar.
The registry explicitly uses the title Frere Brother, pointing directly to his origins in the Dominican order.
I need to pause on the historical dissonance here.
You're saying a man sworn to religious orders, a Dominican friar who has taken vows, evolves into a venture capitalist underwriting the most brutal plantation economy on earth.
Yes.
How does the Church of 1797 reconcile that position?
It is only contradictory if we view the 18th century church through a modern lens. In the context of the French Caribbean, the church was not an external, passive observer of the slavery system.
It was a participant.
It was deeply and institutionally embedded in its architecture. The Code Noir of 1685, the sweeping legal decree that codified slavery in the French Empire, explicitly mandated the Catholic instruction and baptism of all enslaved individuals.
The church essentially provided a theological framework that allowed the system to legally and morally operate.
It provided theological justification, but it also provided direct financial lubrication. Religious orders, including the Dominicans, owned and operated massive, highly profitable sugar plantations themselves.
They managed boiling houses, they purchased enslaved humans,
And extracted wealth to fund their ecclesiastical operations in the colonies and back in Europe.
Father Thomas functioning as a creditor to the planter class was a direct reflection of a society where elite wealth and religious authority were inextricably linked.
That institutional reality brings us to a deeply disturbing detail within the manuscript.
Embedded within the polite, formal updates of the letter, Father Thomas mentions his personal living arrangements.
He writes that he is keeping a little Negro and some mules, left to me free of charge for my use.
He categorizes an enslaved human child alongside pack animals.
He places them in the exact same grammatical and economic category, treating both strictly as borrowed tools to ease his increasing infirmity.
We are reading the factual reality of the colonial mindset.
As the colony burns around him, as the enslaved population rises up to dismantle the machinery of the plantations.
This priest maintains his grip on human property. The child is viewed purely as a utility.
It highlights the profound inability of the colonial elite to recognize the humanity of the people they enslaved. Even as the revolution shatters their world and forces them into exile, they remain entirely locked into the legal and economic logic of human ownership.
And that very specific logic traveled with them as they fled across the ocean.
Which brings us to the American coast and the next phase of this letter's survival.
You mentioned the typical 3-week crossing. But this specific letter took 62 days to receive its Philadelphia postmark on August 19th, 1797.
It was a tremendous delay.
Where was this piece of paper delayed for an entire month?
The delay was caused by a microscopic threat that was reshaping the Atlantic world: yellow fever.
Philadelphia, the destination port for this vessel, lived in absolute dread of Caribbean ships.
The catastrophic yellow fever epidemic of 1793 had killed over 5,000 people in Philadelphia. It temporarily paralyzed the United States federal government.
The origin of that outbreak had been traced directly to ships arriving with refugees from Saint-Domingue.
By the summer of 1797, when the fever returned to the city streets, the port health officials were taking absolutely no chances with arriving vessels.
Every single vessel arriving from the West Indies was subjected to strict, uncompromising protocols.
The ship carrying our letter would have been halted at the lazaretto.
The quarantine station at State Island, situated on the Delaware River just outside the city.
The vessel, the crew, the cargo, and the mailbags were trapped in medical bureaucracy. They were subjected to indefinite holds and crude fumigation techniques,
Often involving the burning of sulfur below decks.
The tension of that delay is palpable because the recipient, Monsieur Rousseau, was waiting just 20 miles upriver.
The ship sat rotting in quarantine for weeks, while the man who owed 28,000 livres was mere hours away.
We must examine exactly where Monsieur Rousseau was waiting, because the address written on the outside of this folded letter is a masterpiece of legal geography.
It reads, "To his house in Burlington, via Philadelphia."
If you look closely at a map of the area, you immediately notice the calculation in that routing.
Why instruct the postal system to route the commerce and correspondence through the bustling port of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but maintain your physical residence across the river in Burlington, New Jersey?
The answer is rooted in a highly calculated legal strategy concerning human property. Pennsylvania had passed the Gradual Abolition Act in 1780.
It was the first legislative act of its kind, but it contained a very specific, merciless provision for visiting slave owners.
Any non-resident who brought enslaved people into Pennsylvania could hold them there for exactly 6 months.
On the 6-month and 1-day mark, those enslaved individuals became legally, permanently free.
The abolitionist lawyers in Philadelphia, organized under the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, were highly aggressive. They were actively hunting down French refugee slaveholders in the local courts,
utilizing writs of habeas corpus to enforce that exact 6-month law.
New Jersey was a completely different legal jurisdiction. At that time, New Jersey had passed no such abolition law.
By physically living in Burlington, on the eastern bank of the Delaware River, Monsieur Rousseau and his fellow refugees utilized the state border as a legal shield.
They could take a ferry across the river to Philadelphia in the morning. They could conduct their banking, collect their mail from the West Indies, and engage in international commerce.
Then they would return to New Jersey by evening.
This commute kept their enslaved workforce entirely outside the jurisdiction of Pennsylvania's emancipation laws.
If you consider the geography, the Delaware River was not just a waterway for commerce. It was utilized by this refugee network as a tactical barrier to protect their wealth.
Monsieur Rousseau was not acting in isolation. He was part of a meticulously constructed network of exiles operating along the river.
To understand the depth and power of that network, we must introduce a critical connection: the widow Vollenbrun.
We must explicitly identify who she was right at the beginning of this narrative to understand the web of alliances.
Her given name was Marie-Jeanne Drouillard.
But she was a born Turbay. She was the direct sister of the late Monsieur Turbay de la Mare,
The very man Father Thomas repeatedly mentions in our manuscript as the original debtor.
That connects the entire financial web. The uncle whose immense debts Monsieur Rousseau absorbed is the brother of the widow Vollenbrun.
This is one massive, interconnected family syndicate moving capital and human property across the Atlantic.
Marie-Jeanne Drouillard's journey to the American North was harrowing. She had remained in Saint-Domingue far longer than most of her peers,
Desperately trying to hold on to the physical estates.
Finally, in November 1796, unwilling to surrender her wealth to the revolutionary forces, she chartered a brig named the Mary and Elizabeth.
She loaded that ship with 20 enslaved men, women, and children whom she actively refused to release.
She was treating them as movable capital, utilizing their labor and financial value to fund her exile in the United States.
The voyage was a disaster. Navigating the treacherous waters of the Caribbean, the Mary and Elizabeth ran aground.
And was completely destroyed in a shipwreck in the Bahamas.
The vessel was lost to the reefs.
Yet all 29 people aboard the widow, her companions, and the 20 enslaved individuals survived the wreck.
They spent weeks stranded in the islands before finally securing passage northward to New York.
From there, she moved south to connect with her son, Jean-Baptiste. He was already strategically stationed in the safe zone of Trenton, New Jersey,
situated just up the river from where Rousseau was receiving his mail in Burlington.
This demonstrates the deep, calculating embeddedness of these exiles. When they fled the burning colony, they did not scatter randomly.
They consolidated their families, their capital, and their legal strategies.
However, the history of this specific family network contains a historical irony that is profound.
The Hilary Baker connection.
Yes. Jean-Baptiste Drouillard, the son of the widow Vollenbrun, had a son of his own. That son eventually married the daughter of Hilary Baker.
Hilary Baker was the mayor of Philadelphia during the late 1790s.
He was not merely the mayor. Hilary Baker was a co-founder and highly active member of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society.
He was a leading figure in the very organization that was actively utilizing the courts to strip the French refugees of their enslaved workforce.
The son of a refugee planter family, a family that had survived shipwreck and meticulously navigated state borders explicitly to maintain their legal right to own human beings, marries the daughter of the abolitionist mayor, trying to dismantle that exact legal right.
It demonstrates how rapidly and intimately this displaced Caribbean aristocracy embedded themselves into the highest political and social echelons of the young American Republic.
They were not passive victims of a revolution.
They were highly active agents, manipulating the legal codes of the United States to preserve their hierarchy and their wealth.
That brings us back to the survival of the fragile paper on the table in front of us.
When you trace the entire 1,400-mile journey, the survival of the document is remarkable.
This single piece of heavy rag paper was written in a town surrounded by a revolutionary army.
It was smuggled across an 8-mile stretch of war-torn plains.
It evaded a massive fleet of French privateers hunting American ships in the Windward Passage.
It sat locked in a yellow fever quarantine on the Delaware River.
Finally, it was routed perfectly through the complex legal geography of the American North to reach a meticulously constructed safe haven in New Jersey.
We must leave you with a final thought regarding that safe haven. The letter arrived safely, and the river towns of Burlington and Trenton seemed quiet.
But this network of exiles, the Rousseaus, the Turbays, the Drouillards, were not looking for peace.
They were actively scheming.
They were marshaling their capital, utilizing their family alliances, and manipulating the law to rebuild their empire of sugar and forced labor on new soil.
There's a physical manifestation of that corrosive intent right on the page. The dark script that Father Thomas used to demand his money and claim his human property is highly acidic iron gall ink.
Made from oak galls and iron sulfate, the ink bites into the paper.
Over the centuries, the sulfuric acid byproduct is chemically burning through the cellulose fibers. The very words of the empire are slowly, inevitably eating away at the document.
It is a physical metaphor for the corrosive system these men were trying to save. The investigation into Father Thomas's ultimate fate, the collection of that immense 28,000 livre debt, and the broader path of the Haitian Revolution will lead us into even darker territory. Thank you for your attention. We hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for the next episode.